You faced your shadow. You relived painful memories, confronted the traumas that haunted you, dismantled the patterns that kept you trapped. You did everything they said would set you free. But now, instead of peace, you wake up with a heavy emptiness. Nothing seems to make sense. The flame that once drove you has gone out. And this is where so many people panic. They think they've failed. But you're not broken. This emptiness isn't a flaw. It's proof the process worked. Carl Jung said that when the persona collapses, the old fuel disappears. Fear, shame, and the need to prove your worth no longer hold power. So the big question is, what if this emptiness is actually the hidden doorway to your rebirth? What if it's in this silence that you finally discover who you really are? What you're feeling isn't ordinary discouragement. It's not laziness. It's the death of the old engines that ran your life without you even noticing. For years, you ran not out of love, but to escape rejection. Not out of choice, but to prove you were enough. And now that those engines have died, what's left is silence. That silence looks a lot like depression, and that's why so many people get confused. But Jung explained it clearly. When the persona falls, you lose the mask, but you haven't found the new face yet. It's an interval, crossing, the space between the old self that died and the self that hasn't been born. This emptiness isn't a void, it's fertile ground. It looks like death, but it's really germination. And what I'm about to show you is how to move through this space without giving up on yourself until the real motivation, steady, nourishing, and true, finally begins to rise. You've got to get one thing straight. The emptiness you feel after doing shadow work doesn't mean you're broken. What's really going on is that your old way of pushing yourself just doesn't work anymore. Back then, you kept moving so you wouldn't get rejected, so you wouldn't let someone down, so you wouldn't have to deal with shame. Those were the invisible engines driving you forward. But once you heal those wounds, those engines shut down. And what's left is silence, which a lot of people mistake for depression. Carl Jung said this collapse of the persona is inevitable. The persona is the mask you built to survive, the good kid, the competent professional, the always available friend. But when that mask starts to fall, it feels like you've completely lost your sense of direction. It's like you've been running for years with the GPS telling you every turn, and suddenly the signal just drops. You still have your legs, you can still move, but you freeze because you've got no clue where to go without those outside instructions. Think of some real-life examples. Maybe you knew someone who studied like crazy just because they were terrified of disappointing their parents. Once that fear got healed, their discipline vanished too. Or that coworker who pulled 12-hour days because he was scared stiff of being called lazy. Once the shame lost its grip, the drive he had for work disappeared. That's not laziness. That's the absence of a motor that was fueled by pain. And this phase is scary because our culture only applauds people who are always on the move. If you're not chasing something, they'll slap a label on you. Unmotivated, lazy, even depressed. But here's the kicker. Depression is when nothing makes sense. The emptiness after healing is when the old meanings have died and the new ones haven't been born yet. That difference is huge, and it keeps you from falling into the trap of thinking you're a failure. The emptiness, as strange as it feels, is just a transition. It's like those months you're between jobs after walking away from a toxic workplace. At first, you feel totally lost, no routine, no deadlines, no pressure. But that space is exactly what lets you figure out what you actually want, without fear or the need to please. Yeah, it hurts, but it's the womb of a new life. And here's the bottom line. This isn't a lack of motivation, it's a lack of the old engines. The ones built on trauma, fear, and shame. That so-called emptiness is nothing more than the pause between the end of one kind of fuel and the rise of another, much more real. But to truly get how this transition works, you've got to look straight at those old engines that were running your life without you even noticing. We've seen that emptiness isn't the absence of strength, it's just the absence of those old engines. Now it's time to crack open the box and take a real look at how those engines worked. For years, you thought your choices were conscious, but in reality, they were invisible gears pulling the strings. The fear of rejection, the need to prove your worth, the shame of failing. All of it spun like a hidden machine, pushing you forward without you even realizing it. Picture a giant piece of machinery running in a basement. Inside, gears grind day and night, turning fear into movement. You thought the energy came from you, but in truth, it was that machine doing the work. Shadow work flips the switch on that hidden structure. And when the noise stops, what's left is just you, no motor, no gears turning. That silence is what freaks people out because they don't know how to walk without that old mechanism. The shock comes when you realize that even your ambition and your discipline, things you thought were pure virtues, were often just fear in disguise. That rigid routine of studying, working, pushing yourself to the max, was it really love for what you were doing? Or was it fear of being seen as useless? That question stings, because it shows that most of your drive didn't come from awareness but from the desperate need not to disappoint anyone. Here's a straight-up example. You thought you were running toward success, but you were really just running away from failure. That's a brutal difference. Running to win is a choice. Running to avoid losing is a reflex. And once that reflex gets healed, the running stops. Suddenly, you look around and realize there's nowhere left to escape to. That's when the emptiness hits because the old fuel is gone. But listen, that doesn't mean you've lost your strength. It just means the secret machine that was moving you finally broke down. It's like driving a car that always moved because someone hidden in the back seat was pressing the gas. One day, that person disappears, and you realize you never actually learned how to drive yourself. Scary, right? But necessary, because without that shock, you'd keep living as a passenger in your own life. And this is exactly where the transformation begins. Learning to move without those invisible gears. Learning to walk without being shoved by fear or shame. But before you can discover the new kind of fuel that's going to guide you from here on out, you've got to face the collapse that comes when the old machine finally shuts off. Maybe you're thinking, all right, I get the theory, but does this really play out in real life? Oh, it does way more often than you'd imagine. That emptiness that shows up when the old engines shut down isn't the exception. It's almost the rule in the healing process. And to prove it, let me walk you through two stories that show exactly what I mean. You might even see yourself in them. The first one's about Sarah. After years of battling anxiety, she dove into therapy, books, and self-discovery practices. She finally broke free from that constant fear of being judged, and for the first time, she could breathe in peace. But with peace came a shock. Her career in marketing, which once felt like her purpose, suddenly made no sense at all. Turns out what fueled her wasn't passion, but the fear of failing. That's when Sarah hit what Jung called the nigredo, the symbolic death of the old self. It's that stage where everything feels gray, colorless. The issue wasn't the career itself, but the fact that the gear driving her energy had stopped spinning. Without anxiety pushing her, she had no fuel left, and the emptiness she felt wasn't depression. It was simply the space left behind after her persona crumbled. Now take David. He was a respected architect, admired for his talent and discipline. But after healing some deep childhood wounds, he realized his career no longer fit him. The praise kept coming, but he felt disconnected, like he was stuck playing a role that didn't belong to him anymore. That's a tough pill to swallow, because it shakes your whole identity. In his case, the breakthrough came out of nowhere. He joined a project restoring abandoned buildings. No pressure, no status, no career games. And in that work, he uncovered a different kind of fire. His motivation wasn't about proving his worth anymore. It was about the joy of creating something useful and alive. That spark showed him life still had plenty to offer, just not in the old way he was living it. These two stories prove the point. Emptiness isn't a sign of failure. It's the prelude to rebirth. It shows up to clear space for a truer sense of meaning. And since you've made it this far, let me ask you straight. Have you ever felt this? If you have, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because this is just the start of a much deeper journey. The ego is the social self you learn to put on for the world. It moves through the need to be accepted and the fear of being rejected. It's what makes you chase compliments, compare yourself to others, and constantly try to prove your worth. That kind of motivation can look like willpower, but in reality, it's just short-term fuel. You keep running, but you're running scared of stopping. The ego works like artificial light. Sure, it shows you the way, but it doesn't feed you on the inside. It's like staying up night after night under a lamp. You can see, but you're still exhausted. That's why so many achievements driven by the ego leave you with an empty taste. You finally get there, look around, and think, that's it. The self, though, is a whole different thing. It's the most authentic core of who you are. It doesn't need to prove anything, doesn't live off comparison, and doesn't move out of fear. The self is driven by genuine curiosity, the urge to create, the truth that actually makes sense to you. It's like sunlight. It doesn't just shine, it warms, nourishes, and makes things grow. When you act from the self, you don't just feel clear, you feel alive. But here's the catch. When the ego loses its power, the self doesn't just walk in right away. First comes silence. And that silence feels uncomfortable because you've been so used to being pushed by the constant noise of fear and pressure. When that noise stops, it feels like there's nothing left. But really, it's just the pause before a deeper kind of motivation steps in. It's like switching off all the artificial lights in a room at night. For a moment, you can't see a thing, just pure darkness. But give it a few seconds, and your eyes start picking up the natural light outside. That's exactly what happens here. The emptiness you feel is just the transition between one engine that died and another that's being born. So the real question now is, how do you tell in practice whether it's the ego or the self driving you? Because the difference is subtle, but it changes everything. One thing is acting so you don't lose. A whole other thing is acting for the joy of creating something real. Now that you get the difference between ego and self, it's time to put it into practice. Because here's the deal. Knowing it in theory isn't enough. If you don't feel it in your own skin, you'll stay stuck in the same old pattern. So I've got a simple but powerful exercise for you. Grab a pen and paper or just open up your notes app. We're going to make 2 lists, and trust me, the difference will be crystal clear when you're done. On the first list, write down everything you think you should want. That promotion everybody says matters, buying a new car because it looks like success, maybe even getting married just because your family expects it. Pay close attention. Those shoulds usually come packed with obligation, fear of judgment, or the urge to prove yourself. They look shiny on the outside, but deep down they don't warm you up at all. On the second list, write the stuff that actually pulls you in, even if it feels weird or makes no sense. Maybe it's learning guitar, diving into medieval history, traveling solo to some random place nobody gets, or starting a little garden in your backyard. These things might not earn you status, but they spark curiosity and joy. That's the self showing up. Simple, authentic, with no need for justification. Once you compare the 2 lists, you'll spot the brutal difference. The first list feels heavy. It's like someone standing over your shoulder, auditing your life. The second list feels light. You look at it and think, man, I could spend hours doing this and not even notice the time. That contrast is where you'll see the difference between ego-driven motivation and self-driven energy. Here's the uncomfortable truth. A lot of what you always called motivation was really just anxiety in disguise. The rigid discipline, the rush to achieve, the craving for recognition. All of it tasted like fear. What looked like energy was actually an internal alarm trying to protect you from rejection. When that alarm finally shuts off, what's left is emptiness. And only from that emptiness can you find a motivation that actually nourishes you. This exercise isn't about dropping everything and blindly following the second list. It's about learning to recognize where your energy comes from. Because long-term, only the self sustains. The ego might push, but it always demands a price. The self pulls you naturally, and what it offers isn't anxiety. It's peace in motion. And that, right there, is the doorway to the breakthrough you're about to experience. After doing the list exercise, maybe you felt something strange, a kind of inner silence. And here's where most people freak out because they mistake that silence for a loss of motivation. But in reality, it's a sign you're moving forward. You're not empty because you failed, you're empty because you outgrew the old motives that used to push you. And now there's finally space for something more real to take root. That emptiness is like the silence before the music starts again. Picture yourself at a concert. The orchestra plays, then everything stops for a few seconds. Those seconds feel endless, but that's exactly when the anticipation builds and the new movement gains power. The same thing happens inside you. Silence isn't the absence of life. It's the setup for a deeper rhythm. Another powerful image is a field in winter. At first glance, it looks dead. Bare trees, frozen ground, absolute stillness. But underneath the soil, seeds are tucked away, getting ready for spring. That emptiness you feel is exactly that, an inner winter protecting the germination of a new way of living. Without that pause, nothing would bloom for real. Here's what you need to remember. You haven't lost motivation. What you've lost are the old motives. Fear, shame, the need to please, all that has stopped being your fuel. And of course, without that old motor, it feels like you've stalled. But the truth is, you've just shifted into another rhythm, one that's healthier and still forming within you. In practice, this silence might show up as wanting to slow down, saying no to things you used to accept, or just spending more time alone. Instead of fighting it, the key is to embrace it. Because the more you resist, the longer it takes for the new to emerge. Silence isn't an enemy. It's a teacher. It teaches you to wait, to trust. And here's the big key. Once you see emptiness as preparation, you stop feeling guilty for it. You start to see it as part of the process, not as proof you've failed. It's in that quiet space that the motivation of the self begins to whisper, subtle, small, but powerful. And the real breakthrough happens when you finally learn how to recognize those whispers. This emptiness isn't the period at the end of the sentence. It's the comma between the life you once knew and the one that's about to begin. It's not failure, it's transition. The silence that feels uncomfortable right now is the same silence that prepares the soil for spring. It's the womb of authenticity, unseen, but full of life. So take a deep breath and trust, because what looks like an ending is really just the announcement of a beginning. If this spoke to you, hit the like button, subscribe, and keep walking this journey in the next video that's already waiting for you on the end screen.